Okay, so this is my second learning analysis journal, specifically focused on culture and the way that it can impact learning and learning behaviors. So section one, the experience section, the one I wanted to, or what I kind of, the example I wanted to take was, so last week, specifically is when I started observing one of my students that I support. Her name is Leela. She is a 10th grader in an American history class, and we are currently learning about the American Revolution, and specifically our independence from Britain, but also European colonizers coming over and the impact that that's had on the Americas. However, so for Leela, when these videos would start playing or when we would be doing these activities specifically in class, she disengaged. She would take her headphones, put those in, and then kind of go right back to just sort of listening to music or looking at memes or hanging out on social media, which is hard because as a student that already has an IEP, her assignments tend to get done a little bit slower than the rest of the class, so it's important that she doesn't fall behind. And then I guess taking that a step further then too, upon like having to take the test for this unit, she really sort of struggled with writing anything for essay questions. We're typically asked about how the Americans won the war and what was really important to that. Yeah. So then the second section here is the processing section. And as the topic is about culture and the way that it affects behavior, one of the biggest things for Leela, and that will maybe help explain this a little more, is that she's Native American. So for her, she really feels, and she's told me she feels a cultural disconnect from these materials, from the way that course materials talk about Native Americans, and it's generally more positive than it was when I was in high school over 10 years ago. There's definitely more credit given to Native Americans and the roles that they have played in helping colonizers, helping pilgrims as they come over, teaching them how to how to not grow crops in sand and instead do that in soil. Just things like that that really helped Europeans pave the way for creating the Americas and the United States of America. And then, however, though, I also kind of believe that because Leela's on an IEP that allows her to take breaks, and also allows her to leave class about 5 minutes early so that she can get to her next class on time, that these two things together have really sort of helped create a feeling of learned helplessness, which we've definitely talked about before in class. And it also kind of strains then the relationship between her and myself as I try to get her to focus on the activities that she needs to do. And again, I understand that this is hard. Somebody that is Native American probably doesn't want to read some of the awful things that have happened to her ancestors and the people that are like her, because representation definitely matters when it comes to teaching and keeping kids engaged and feeling relevant to the class. So the next section then is the generalizing section, and some of the ideas that we talked about in the book that came to my mind are sort of the idea of stereotype threat. And sort of this idea, right, stereotype threat, is Woolfolk talks about on page 236, and sort of this idea that because you are one race, you're expected to act in a certain manner. And the book specifically talks about being African American and how that means that African American, especially males, are expected to do poorly on tests. And so because they are expected to do poorly, there's this pressure that they will do worse. For Leela in this situation, I think for her, and again, this is maybe biased or not fully knowing her home life, that she feels stupid and that she doesn't think that this stuff is important to her, and that people don't typically sort of recognize that she is a Native American in that class, and that when they when we're learning about things like Christopher Columbus cutting off hands of the Native Americans in the Caribbean when he came over, right? Like those things are, you just talk about that as if it's kind of brutal and then you move on from it. For the Native Americans, you think about the fact that like the Pilgrims wouldn't have survived. The British wouldn't have been able to navigate around the colonists when they were fighting because they didn't know the land, and the Native Americans did, and they would pay them. But what you hear about is that happens, but then the Native Americans get picked off first in guerrilla tactics because they're the ones that know what's going on, and they're the ones that are being displaced. So somehow there's this disconnect between the success and the capability of Native Americans and the fact that they're just being wiped out for colonization efforts, which is hard to talk about. I feel like, and hard to make a connection that way. The other part of that too is this kind of brings into the notion of like culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant material. Again, as I mentioned before, things are much better, but when the things that you're learning about that are directly related to your identity and to the person that you are, it's not much. It's really these kind of, I mean, all of us as Americans know what happened to Native Americans in in the passing of time in the history of the 1700s and the 1800s. So taking that a step further, we talk about those things quickly. We acknowledge that they've happened, but we don't really spend any time on what has actually happened to these people. We don't really spend a whole lot of time exemplifying the successful Native Americans that really should have made a name and should be role models for everybody that's in that classroom, so you can learn about different cultures, learn about these different things. And then also too, talking about biases, this idea of learned helplessness and her IEP that allows her to take breaks and allows her to leave early. There may be some bias there as I work with her every day, and that she'll use that 5 minutes early to leave and not work on anything that she wants to work on, and that doesn't translate, but overlaps over into like the biology class that I also support her in. At that point, we're not really talking about anything that's culturally relevant. We're talking about things that are much more concrete, so science, things that you talk about in biology. We're learning about carbon bonds right now, so there's no cultural relevance to that outside of how do they access this material? Do they have somebody that can help them out at home do this? And again, I don't know if she has that. My assumption would be that she doesn't, but again, that's an assumption. So I'd take that with a grain of salt. Additionally, I guess that I don't want her to have this idea of learned helplessness and then sort of disidentify who she is, because she doesn't think that the material is culturally relevant, and that kind of all loops it back into how then do we successfully help Leela hit her end goal, of which is just to be successful and to achieve and answer these questions, and how do we keep her engaged and how do we help that? So, and that leads me into then section 4, which is the sort of practical application of it. And again, so for me, getting Leela to succeed is the end goal. And one of the strategies that I have tried to employ in this actual situation is getting her to critique the teacher and getting her to critique the materials that we have, and whether she does that face-to-face with the teacher or she does it by using me as a proxy. I'm fine with both of those, but I really want her to feel like her identity and her culture is important in the class, and it is, and I know that she's very capable of learning this material, and she's even expressed to me before we've gotten to topics about examples in history of how Americans have been brutal to Native Americans. So again, she does have that capacity. But going back to this idea of critiquing the teacher, I think that this becomes important for building that relationship strand that's talked about in Woolfolk. That's again on page 251. At least in my book it is. And that by critiquing the teacher, we're able to then make adaptations to the curriculum that we teach, or hopefully able to find things that are more culturally relevant or culturally sensitive, that keeps that identity and promotes that identity of whatever culture you may or may not be talking about. So definitely into it definitely overlaps with pedagogy and curriculum related around slavery and African Americans, because that is also something that we talk about at this point. As well as we get into westward expansion of America and thinking about Irish and Chinese settlers that are coming over, and so on and so forth, with any other culture that schools choose to engage in, and they should choose to engage in many of them. Kind of building on that then too, if we have this critique, then we're able to, again, keep things culturally relevant, and that if we could exemplify, or if I were to change anything about this, then that we would add in more examples of successful Native Americans and the ways that they try to extend peace, and maybe really exemplify more or spend more time talking about these people and doing assignments on them, so you actually get a feeling of, hey, we should really look at these role models from a different culture. If you're working in my experience, a primarily white district, to be able to give exposure to these different cultures to better prepare students for just working in the real world and getting outside of the city that they grew up in, if that's what their demographics are typically like. So that's my learning analysis journey for culture.